Hey, welcome into Strictly Speaking. Good to have you here. So, today we're talking with Scott Powell. Scott's a veteran of the corporate, academic, and research worlds. He's taught at two universities, served on two corporate boards, been an entrepreneur, founded two companies, been a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute since 2012. That was after 6 years with Stanford's Hoover Institution. He's written three books, the latest of which is Rediscovering America. That spent 8 weeks at the #1 bestseller spot on Amazon in the history genre. And today, we discuss Rediscovering America with Scott Powell here on Strictly Speaking. This episode of Strictly Speaking with Bob Frantz is brought to you by Get More Tank. What is it? Get More Tank is a fuel catalyst that's going to save you money every single month on gas. Get More Tank is a tablet with active ingredients that add big mileage to every tank. Made in America, the Get More Tank formula has been used for decades by trucking companies and heavy industry. Now the Get More Tank formula is available to people like you and me. Get More Tank works in any gas or diesel engine, cleans your engine, lowers emissions, and you'll feel improved engine performance every time you step on the gas. Get More Tank works for cars, trucks, boats, motorcycles, four-wheelers, mowers, and blowers, contractors, electricians, plumbers, painters, lawn service companies. Get More Tank is going to save you money and extend the life of your engines. If you're an owner-operator running your rig around town or across the country, Get More Tank is going to save you money too. A 5-pack on sale only at getmoretank.com for just $22 plus shipping. Use promo code Bob and get 10% off of that. Save your money and get better engine performance at getmoretank.com. That's getmoretank.com. Scott, thank you so much for taking the time. How are you?
Very well, Bob. Thank you.
So we're rediscovering America. You decided to rediscover it and write a book about what you found. Is it a fair characterization to say you're not exactly thrilled with what you've rediscovered about this country?
Well, what I discovered about the founding of the country, the the depth and the integrity of the people in the founding of this country was absolutely remarkable. I mean, you could say, and this is not an overstatement, that America was the first nation in human history, in all of human history, that was based on the idea that people had unalienable God given rights. They had rights that couldn't be taken away from them by the state. That's unique to the American founding. No other nation experienced that in their history. The state always determined people's rights, correct? Yes.
Yeah, well, you're exactly right.
So,
And
so
that's, of course,
America was a revolutionary country in that regard, and that the orientation towards maximum freedom for the individual uh, really enabled America to prosper like no other nation. I mean, we went from, the Constitution was ratified in 1789. From that time, uh, in just 120 years, America became the #1 economy in the world, the greatest military power in the world. And that's like a stock car going from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds. When you think of history, it's really incredible. And but we have lost a lot of that early success because the state has grown so much and people's rights have been taken away. And we have a big problem with corruption now. It's really a serious problem. Whereas in the early days, you had a basically a Christian oriented country. The culture of America was shaped by Christianity. And
well,
so
we're not
that
supposed to say that part out loud, though, right? We're not supposed to say that part. We cannot have
well,
church and state
we have to say it out loud
commingling
because
like.
it's history. And so if we're going to give it a proper accounting of history, we can't leave that out. If we're to talk about the history and the behavior of the Muslim states, the radical Muslim states, we couldn't begin to talk about the subject until you understood the ideology behind jihad. Uh, those are the ideas that have shaped the behavior of the radical Muslim world. So, similarly, shouldn't we talk about the ideas that shaped early America? Of course.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
and in that regard, rediscovering America as it was founded and as it was built and as it corrected its mistakes, as it worked its way through its problems to try to become the more perfect union, if you will. That sense of rediscovery is glorious. It's discovering what America has become that I'm very, very concerned about, and I think that's kind of maybe the core of what I wanted to start with here, because you have talked about the spiritual and the cultural decline, the breakdown of
Yes.
this country. And so I want to ask what you mean by spiritual, by cultural, and moreover, what kind of a time period are we talking about here? At what point did we start to devolve from becoming this glorious republic, one that is built upon the rights of the individual, not the rights of the state? Everything that you just laid out. At what point do you think we started to separate from that and talk about that spiritual and cultural decline?
Well, I think it's good to go back, talk about some of the key points of our history. Certainly the War of Independence period, that early America, very important. But we actually, when the Constitutional Convention convened, all the delegates understood that they could not tackle the issue of slavery and come out at the end of this convention with a new government. It was too problematic. But the reality is that the delegates were aware that it needed to be addressed in some way, and so in Article 1, Section 9, we have a a very clear statement in the Constitution that says that slave trade would end after 20 years. That would make it 1807, 1808. All slave trade was to end in America. Now, most people don't know that it's in the Constitution. And in fact, the 1619 Project makes the counter argument that America was born with slavery. No, we were born with acknowledging that slavery was wrong and should be phased out. They weren't sure how to get it done because remember, the founding of America, there was a great deal of caution about vesting too much power in a federal government. There was to be more power in the states than in the central government. And so I believe that the delegates recognized that slavery wasn't a problem in the northern states, it was a problem in the southern states, the so-called Confederate states. And and those states had to deal with that problem uh, at the right time in their own way. I believe that was the consensus. There was certainly a strong uh, moral opposition to slavery in the South. The South arguably was more Christian than the North, and it's hard to justify slavery in any sort of Christian with a Christian orientation. So, in any case, though, we dealt with it at that time, but we ended up fighting a civil war, which was our most bloody war. 640,000 Americans were killed in the Civil War. That's greater than the sum of all the other wars combined together, leaving out the latest, wars in the Middle East. But it's really incredible how awful that period was, and that was a price we paid. But even after slaves were freed, and remember, the war didn't start over slavery. Lincoln himself said that slavery would not be an issue in his first, in his presidency. In his inaugural address, he said he didn't want to make that an issue. But from the time he was elected in November till he was inaugurated in March, the inauguration period was longer then. uh, 7 states had seceded from the Union. So he walked into a huge problem in keeping America together. And we
How
ended
did
up,
the Confederate States justify what you just described? You said they were more Christian, arguably, than the northern states in terms of the population of the southern states,
in terms of the
and yet
culture,
some,
yeah,
yeah, and yet that was the side that essentially wanted to hold on to slavery. They believed it was integral, to the economy and to their ability to produce and so on and so forth. And so, how did these Christians in the South navigate their way to saying, yeah, but it's okay if we continue to use human beings as our farm animals, which is what they use them for?
Well, it's true, but I don't know. I mean, slavery existed in only really 5% of the population in the South. But to address your question, first of all, we have to talk about the cause of the Civil War, which was secession. That 7 states had left the Union when Abraham Lincoln assumed the presidency in March of 1861. And what was he to do? Well, unfortunately, the Southerners did explain why they were left the Union. They first of all knew that it was their right. This was debated at the time of the Constitutional Convention, and as I mentioned earlier, there was concern about abuse of power by a federal government. And then the question was raised, and it was addressed, and it was answered that if a state felt that they no longer were prospering under the Union, under the United States, if you will, did they have the right to leave the Union? And it was agreed that they had the right to leave. Any state that felt that they had irreconcilable differences with the federal government had the right to leave. Well, it turns out that there was a long train of abuses against the South, actually, beyond slavery. I mean, the economics of the time were that the South was very productive in agriculture. And by the time of the war, the main crop was cotton. So cotton was being exported largely to Great Britain, where it was turned into cloth and then woven into clothing and linens and all sorts of things that people wanted. And then it was brought back into the United States, and it came through the port of Charleston to a large extent in the South. That was the largest port, and duties were collected on that importation. Large duties were collected at Charleston by the federal government, and apparently the South never saw. They didn't share the wealth of the tariffs, of the duties, with the southern states. So they had this real deep complaint that they were being discriminated against, that they were not being treated fairly economically, and they had needs just as the North had in terms of expenditures. So if they're getting nothing from the federal government, that was a problem. That was a chief reason for seceding, actually.
Well, I understand that, but I mean, you ask any neo historian, they're going to say, well, of course the Civil War was over slavery, and yeah, of course they seceded, and of course they seceded because of their complaints about the funds that they were receiving from the newly produced goods coming in, and so on and so forth. But wouldn't the answer to that be, well, that's because you guys had slaves and we wanted to end slavery, and so therefore we were going to not make things easy on you. If you hadn't had to have done that, we would have had no need for this war.
Well, you've got a point there. I don't have enough depth of all the debates on that to be able to say, yeah, that the North was punishing the South indirectly. I don't
Well,
think
and
that.
we don't even have to answer that
Yeah,
question either,
right.
really, Scott. I mean, the real crux, the reason we're even talking about it is we're talking about the glorious founding of the republic, how
Yes,
it was, why it was, what its great moral certainties were, and how we've gotten away from some of those things in modern day. So what we're doing, I don't want to turn this into a whole Civil War lesson or
right.
anything else, but let's go from there. And again, because I asked the question about Christianity and its relationship with slavery and so forth among those who did it. We could even talk about leaders in the North who still owned slaves, even though they were working to actively end slavery, but they
Yeah, there's
still
a lot
own
of.
some themselves. So there's a lot of real crossover stuff there. But the bottom line is we got into the early 1900s, and we get into the Jim Crow era. um, we had a real problem in this country with respect to treating everybody the way the Declaration
Oh,
says we should treat
absolutely,
everybody. And
absolutely.
and so I want to talk or ask you a little bit about that period and what the good and the bad and the ugly were. And again, how did we go from there to where we are now? I know you've got a lot of concerns about the way this country is being run now and its place in the world as well. So let's go from, from that early 1900s period and maybe even all the way through the Civil Rights Act in 1964, because
Sure. Yeah.
that was the sea change.
Well, I think it's important for the audience and all of us to recognize that change doesn't happen overnight. That history is uh, solving deep social problems can take generations. So the Civil War freed the slaves, but there were black laws and Jim Crow laws, as you just pointed out, that really institutionalized discrimination and segregation in the South. So this was a big problem, and it followed us right into the 20th century in a very real way. And it really wasn't until the period of Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, that we really grappled with this as a nation. And again, it was God's hand at work. You know, Martin Luther King was not a perfect man, but God, I believe God raised him up for that role to lead, the freedom movement, if you will. Um, and I think in his speech in Washington, his famous speech, that he looked forward to the day when his children and grandchildren could look forward to the time when they would be evaluated by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. That was really the encapsulation of the vision that Martin Luther King left with the nation. He was, of course, assassinated. And by the way, Lincoln was assassinated. So these are tough. These are tough issues, and the reality is, though, that he gave birth to a very different America, and we took it seriously, and we passed new laws so that discrimination and segregation were really marginalized. Now, you can't necessarily legislate the change in people's attitudes. That has to take place over time. But certainly in among Christians, there was certainly a recognition. And by the way, the Christian church in America has a lot, can give a lot of thanks to the Black church that has been a bit more vibrant than the largely white church because of their period of slavery. They had only God to turn to, and so the depth of Blacks' faith, in some ways, was greater than whites. But we're one nation, and so as we've mixed our cultures, we've all benefited from this diversity that we have. Where we are now, of course, is that ideas were planted that went against all this, and we could trace them back to the late 1800s, certainly the early 20th century gave the birth to what's known as the progressive period. And you had even Teddy Roosevelt, who was a Republican. He had very big government ideas, but it was Wilson probably who became president in 1914, and he had 2 terms that really gave birth to a new vision for America, a progressive vision. And then that was interrupted by Harding and Coolidge, who were big advocates of freedom, both Harding and Coolidge. And we had the roaring 20s as a result, where the economy just boomed in the 20s under Coolidge. And then we had a stock market crash under Herbert Hoover, followed by FDR, where again, Americans turned to government to solve their problems more. And so we created an administrative state during the FDR period. And that administrative state has really just crept more and more into our lives.
Oh,
And
it's exploded. Most people don't know what it is or where how it operates, but it has
especially if you've been,
exploded in size.
most adults today were born in the period where the administrative state was just part of life.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I want to go back to what you said about MLK and the dream, because that dream, which ultimately he died before seeing it fulfilled.
That's right.
That dream is dead. That dream is dead, but not for the reasons you think. It wasn't quashed by those who wanted bigotry and racism. It has been quashed by those who opposed it. And what I mean by that is, the Democrat Party of today the leftist progressives that you're talking about today are the ones who would never let Martin Luther King's dream come to fruition. They do not want color blindness. They make it very, very clear. They want everything to be seen through the lens of race. The first thing I want to judge about you when I see you, you have light skin, you lack melanin, you're an oppressor. And you over here, you're darker skinned. You are the oppressed. It has always been so, and that is the case now. And that is the exact opposite of what MLK talked about. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what
Yes,
happened and
yes,
how we got to that point in roughly 60 years since 1963. When King died in 1964, when the act was passed, we went from let's all be colorblind to let's see nothing but color.
you're so right, Bob. And it's painful for me to, to see where we've gone. But again, the seeds of this were born in progressivism, and progressivism has its primary roots in Marxism. And remember, Marx was the master of dividing people. And originally, the division was between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, the owners of capital and the workers. And his view was that the workers should over, that there should be a revolutionary of the proletariat over the masters of capital, and a remake an equitable distribution. There was not really clarity in Marx, in any Marxist writing, about how this ideal egalitarian society would be created. He was primarily, Marxism is primarily a wrecking ball to bring Western civilization, the market system down. And he had no respect for, representative democracy as we know it. So out of Marxism, it came a lot of things. So the Frankfurt School in Germany was born in the 1930s. These were really radical neo-Marxists. And they believed, because the proletariat never rose up, somehow the proletariat's life became better and better as they lived with capitalism as employees. They could accumulate some wealth. They ended up being able to buy an automobile on the installment plan, and so forth and so on. So life was getting better under capitalism. But for the hardcore Marxists, they didn't like that. So it was Antonio Gramsci in Italy, and it was the Frankfurt School in Germany that came up with this idea that we really need to have a cultural revolution, that we really need to get Marx's ideas put into the culture. And that's when you had this beginning of dividing culture every which way. You could say that it starts.
Kind of like they did under Mao in China. There was
Yes,
literally the exact same
absolutely,
thing.
absolutely. And the cultural revolution that China went through in the 1960s, we're basically having a repeat of that in America, to be truthful.
Explain that.
It's slightly different. Well, this notion of division, and remember, the division went beyond. In China, you didn't have a racial division. So how is Marx going to slice and dice society and end up being able to have more control? Because remember, the goal is control. So he came up with the Cultural Revolution. He turned children against their parents, which is what we're seeing in America to some extent through the transgender movement. In some states like Colorado now, they're considering legislation where if the parents do not acknowledge the child's dysphoria, the child can be taken by the state. Unbelievable that this is happening in one of our states.
That's what makes this country right now unrecognizable. You wrote
That's
that
right.
and you talked about that. That is 100%. We can come back to that a little bit, but let's go back to China, because you said they didn't have racial division, so they had to come up with something else. And what we now know as CRT, which is critical race theory, which of course is Marxist in its origin, they did CCT. They didn't call it that, but it was critical class theory. They
Right.
divided on class rather than race or gender or orientation or things that we do now, and they did that with a hammer, as far as
Absolutely.
turning children against their parents. And if you were black class or red class, as in the colors, not the race, black class or red class, that was a very, very different game.
Yeah, and it was it was the landowners versus the peasants. It was the business owners. So there was a classic Marxist element in Mao's revolution, but he went further in destroying the traditional family and
Yes.
in destroying history. I think he was Um, Lenin did the same thing, but in the case of Mao, he really systematically destroyed all connection with the past in China. He was really recreating China as a new, uh, Marxist China, and he was very successful in doing that. So, and we see that going on in America, don't we? The destruction of our history, the taking down of monuments, the rewriting of history, the influence of Marxism in history books. It's Howard Zinn, and I audited his class when I was a student at Boston University. And was very critical of his thinking. And to his credit, he always would call on me. I filled in the gaps that he left, but he was he was a Marxist who critiqued America from a Marxist lens. His textbook has been used by more American history classes than any other book, which is a travesty because he leaves out all the virtuous things about America. So, in any case,
Well,
critical
and that's
critical theory came out of the Frankfurt School in the 1930s, and then it became early critical theory, and was applied to law, critical law theory, and then it became later critical race theory. But the notion of critical theory, it's to take apart everything. It's to decompose everything into fragmented parts, and then the power brokers, once they have everything fragmented, they can put it back together in a way that doesn't necessarily work, but it gives them the power of explanation. And these ideas really have always been really in the ivory tower of academia, but they certainly came into our country in a bigger way, in the last 10 or 15 years.
I was just going to say, just in this century, we have
Yes,
seen a concerted effort, at least to me, to bring that about, to fragment,
absolutely. Yep,
to break apart the nuclear family. And this, of course, this really even started way back, in the 60s with Johnson, and and making it more advantageous for mothers to marry the state, particularly minority mothers of children. Will pay you to have these babies if, as long as you don't have a man in the house. It was the beginning of the breakdown of the family, and then in this century, we've seen, through the BLM movement, they made it very clear. The founders, Patrice Cullors and her sidekick, I can't remember. They literally wrote it out that we begin with the theory of Marxism, and we deconstruct the nuclear family. That is how they open the capitalist society that we have to authoritarianism to start, and then totalitarianism. When the families are broken up and the kids are being educated by the village, Hillary Clinton once said that. Then they have complete control of the mindset of the people, and they are that. When you control the minds of the people, obviously you now control the people, and this is something that was obviously fundamentals of what Marx wrote.
that's right. I think it's very hard for American people in general to understand and give credence to the fact that there are determined enemies that want to destroy America that live in our country, that live and work in our country. They live and work in academia. I mean, the dominance of Marxism in the social sciences is overwhelming in universities.
But that can't happen here, Scott. That can't happen here.
Well,
That's our
but it
mindset.
has.
We're different. We're America. That happens over there. That happened in Eastern
No,
Europe.
no,
That happened in
it's
Eastern Europe.
happened
That
here.
can't happen here. No.
and and out of the schools of journalists. To train journalists, the best training that you could give to a journalist was understanding how the economy works and having an appreciation of history. If you listen to most journalists, and they're all quite liberal for the most part in the legacy or the so-called mainstream media, they never give you a context to understand anything. They have no connection to history. They have no appreciation of how a market economy works to the advantage of society. They look at everything in a fragmented way, and they too are influenced by the culture. The culture has come to be dominated by anti by secular progressive ideas, as you well know. And so they're at war with Christianity, they're at war with a family. Feminism was born, and when feminism has probably done more harm to good relations between men and women than any other single movement in America. Now I think it's being corrected a bit, as many things are, but I think we have to be aware that it's going to be it's going to take time to correct the problems that we have. But my
Well,
gosh,
I
we're
mean,
making
it's funny. Do we call it a correction or do we call it a movement away from feminism when many of those who pushed and advanced feminism are now responsible for the masculinization of femininity,
yes,
which I just made
yes.
that term up, but that's kind of what's happening.
No, it turns out that there are so many twists and turns. Once you leave the realm of truth, of absolute truth, okay? So where does truth come from? It comes from God, who created all this. He created the scientific laws that govern physics and biology and so forth. But he also created spiritual laws. He created relational laws that are articulated quite comprehensively in the Bible, that when we live this way, life goes better. I liken success in life a little bit like to sports. Take the game of football. If the coach or the referee arrived to a football game between the two sides and announced, "We're going to play this game differently today. There are going to be no rules except one rule, and that's to get your ball over the goal line. But there's no other rules." What would happen to that game? There would be chaos. People would get hurt. It would be horrendous. So, in the same way, we have freedom in America, but there are boundaries and there are rules that when we follow them, life goes better. And as long as we're operating within those rules, and they're pretty broad, I mean, each one of us is unique. And we don't look at life the same way as other people. So therein lies this huge diversity in America, but there have to be, the boundaries have to be in place. You could say, in general, it's the golden rule. It's certainly, respect and civility for others that don't think like you do. Uh, but all of that's been broken down by the neo-Marxists pretty badly.
Well, and we can talk about boundaries and use a synonym for that. A boundary, another synonym for that would be a border. Let's talk
Yes.
about the rules. If we can't start with the first rule, and your football analogy is a really good one there. If the referees came in and said no rules, just go do whatever you got to do to each other. That's kind of what it is here. We're going to erase the actual first rule, which is here is our country, bordered by two countries to the north and south and two oceans to the east and west, and this is ours. And in order to come here and be a part of us, you have to ask permission. The first rule to being here is how to get in here legally. If that is erased and those borders are no longer existent, which is what, again, roughly half of the country seems to support now, and allowed to happen for the last 4 years. If that's the first rule is allowed to be broken as wantonly as it was, and not only allowed to be broken, but almost encouraged, we kind of erased it ourselves and said, just come on in. And if that first rule is broken, how do any of the others apply? How can these people be expected when they come here? And how can the people who are already here, including native born Americans, be expected to follow rules when it appears that there are no rules, Scott? That's I think the larger picture of the immigration debate.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that the American people as a majority fully embraced open borders. It sort of
Half though. Half
it
though,
sort
I
of
think.
yeah, it sort of came with Biden, and before we knew it, we were living in a different country.
Yeah.
But the reality is that things have really changed dramatically, and all the recent polls show that 66% of Americans now support the deportation of all illegal immigrants. All 66%. That's incredible.
It's an
And that
astounding
that
number. Yeah.
poll was taken in early 2025. That poll, in earlier times didn't have those big numbers. So it seems as though Trump's vision and his conviction and the things that he's advocated have gotten some traction. And of course, for people who want to destroy America, they want to destroy Donald Trump, right? Because there are, inside of this adversarial culture, that the enemy within, there is a alternative vision that they have, and the alternative vision primarily is a vague new global order. And America, with its constitution, stands in the way of this global order. And so America has to be broken down. We have to uh, cause America's system and its sovereignty and its constitution to be transformed. And then we can make progress in this new project of a new global order. And it's the elites that are pushing this, as we know. I mean, it's the Bill Gateses who actually embrace this, and the John Kerrys, and so forth. These were people that were respectable people, now embrace an agenda which is hostile to the United States. It's crazy.
Well, it is, and it's more than crazy. It's designed. It's obviously intentional. That was an important part of something that the new border czar, pointed out the other day. He said he's been around doing this thing, trying to fight for law and for order in the United States for 40 some years. He said he's worked with presidents and seen presidents, obviously, over his lifetime. He said there's only been one that literally, actively, and intentionally opened up the border and erased it and allowed an invasion, and then lied for 4 years saying the border's secure, as people just, it's pure propaganda as they spilled into this country. And we're talking about some really, really dangerous people, because there was no vetting whatsoever. We're talking about people on our terrorist watch list. We're talking about people who are gang members, people who are known cartel members, and so on and so forth. And they were all allowed to come in. When that happens, again, and then the people, the American people living in the cities in which all of these people were, bused or flown or driven to or whatever, they're seeing them living a life that they themselves can't live. Scott, people were paying for their groceries, talking about illegal immigrants who don't speak English, in lines at grocery stores, filling their carts with lobster and paying with EBT cards, and then saying your balance is now 1,000, and you got an American citizen behind them with hamburger meat, and trying to make ends meet on their own salaries. When people see that, for lack of a better way of saying it, crime pays, in other words, we don't have to follow the rules, that's how anarchy starts. That's the football
Absolutely.
game. That's the football game you talked about, with no
Yes.
rules, and guys are crowbarring, the defensive player to stop him from tackling the ball carrier. I mean, that's what we're looking at.
Yeah. Very well said, Bob. You articulated our situation very well.
Well, the
So
question
so we're now
question
in
is,
this
how
project
do we come
making.
back from that? Yeah, that's your job now.
Well,
I state the problem, you state the solution.
well, it's amazing that people who stood for righteous causes, be it, go back to Jesus, he was crucified. Martin Luther King, a very righteous cause, he was assassinated. Donald Trump, with all of his personality peccadillos, is, I believe, a fairly righteous man, and he has a vision for America that's more in accord with the constitutional republic of the early days, if you will, than the Democrat vision that we saw in the last 4 years. Look at the persecution that Trump has faced. I mean, I wrote an article that was just published in Newsmax today, wherein I documented the injunctions against the last three presidents. That would be Obama, Biden, and Trump. I think in all of Obama's years there were, I think it was 9 injunctions against Obama in his 8 years. Now with Biden there were a lot more. There was only like 20, I think 28 injunctions in the 4 years of of Biden. But in the 4 years and 3 months of Trump, there have been some 86 injunctions against President Trump. The lawfare, the lawfare that is being waged against Donald Trump is incredible, and this has got to stop. And I think we're seeing steps taken. I think several judges recently have gone to jail for harboring illegals.
Well, that's
right?
that's great. That's created a constitutional crisis, you
No,
realize.
it hasn't at all.
Well, that's what we've been told. It's on
No,
TV. I saw it.
that's
They s
that's called upholding the law. Upholding the law. If
Well, I
you
mean,
aid and
we
if you
we talk
aid and
about
abet a criminal, there's got to be a consequence for that. And if you happen to be wearing a robe as judges do, I'm sorry, no one is above the law.
well, yeah, and I think I heard that somewhere before, from the
I
people who were
know.
defending this judge. They used to say no one is above the law back when they thought they were gonna arrest Donald or, convict Donald Trump. I wanna go back to, who's really paying the price here about what's going on right now, because it's the American people and it's the taxpayers. We'll talk about you wrote recently an article that said the Tesla protesters are wrong. Doge is what's right here. Doge being the Department of Government Efficiency, trying to save my money and yours from extraordinary amounts. And we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. Elon Musk says ultimately trillions, but they're working on them. And they've got up to $150 billion or so right now of waste, fraud, and abuse. And we're
So they had
talking
to
about
stop
theft.
Elon Musk, didn't they? They had to
Yeah,
stop
right.
him. And look what
Yeah.
they did.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. They're trying to stop Musk and his team from helping them. I'm trying to make the talk about some bizarre logic there. This guy is saving us our money that's being sent to foreign countries for causes that have nothing to do with America and nothing to do with assisting us in our lives. But they're sending money from my paycheck. This Friday, I'll get a check. You'll get a check. You open it up and you look at the pay stub and you look at federal withholdings, and you might as well put underneath that money to Bangladesh, money to Kazakhstan for some trans opera on ice or whatever it is. And that came from my paycheck. That should have been in my pocket to help me feed my kids. And instead it was sent over there. Elon Musk is trying to get it back and to stop that from happening anymore. And they're blowing up Teslas for the effort. Help me understand that.
Well, what we're seeing is the breakdown of America. We are seeing domestic terrorism for political purposes right in front of our very eyes. And these are not spontaneous protests. These people that try to burn down Tesla dealerships and light Tesla cars on fire. There may
Mm-hmm.
be an occasional one that's doing it because it's the thing to do. It's now the movement is against Tesla, so we'll join forces. That's what called mob behavior,
Mm-hmm.
mob mentality is when you lose your individual critical faculties and you join in with what everyone else with the movement of the time. But this is scary stuff for America, and I applaud Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, for acting very swiftly. That if you are involved in terrorizing a Tesla dealership, you have a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in jail.
Well,
Really.
I would applaud her if I started to see some handcuffs and I started to
Well,
see some
I
convictions.
agree.
But,
I agree.
because right now it's a whole lot of talk. Um, Same thing about
I don't
a number
disagree.
of things. The Justice Department was also going to get to the bottom of Crossfire Hurricane, and the Justice Department was going to get to the bottom of everything that was done in the lawfare cases against Trump, and so many of the other things that are just completely unconstitutional and wrong from a lawful perspective. And the FBI was supposed to do that too. And I'm waiting. I'm still waiting.
I'm
And I
waiting
know it's
too.
only 100 days or so in
Yeah.
at the time of our conversation, but I'm waiting for some action rather than just, the big, loud, braggadocious words.
Well, I think it's a bit of a balancing act. Well, and then there's, as you point out, uh, we've just had 100 days, and an enormous amount has been done in 100 days. You can't do everything. So I think that there are judgment calls about when is the right time to take these more affirmative steps. Enforcement of the law, sending people to jail. I think those days are coming, and I hope that they do, because in some ways there is no correction for criminal behavior unless you put a clear penalty and you do it repeatedly.
Exactly. There's no
Then you,
deterrent.
then you deter similar crimes from happening in the future. And I think Trump understands this. Certainly, Pam Bondi does. But I'm with you. It can't come soon enough, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and we're talking about things again that I think will continue to happen until there are some serious consequences, and people will say, "Holy cow, look what they're doing now. We can't do this. This guy just got 20 years," and so on and so forth. But I want to branch off into some larger things, historical things here now, Scott, because we were promised by President Trump that we will see the Epstein files. We will see the JFK files. We will see, some of the things that have been kept from the people for whatever righteous, and I use that in scare quotes, reasons. Um, and again, I know it's only been 100 days, but it's been 100 days. And he declassified some of the JFK files, and then they were released, and they were just a whole bunch of black markers, a bunch of redactions. We don't really see much of anything. And the Epstein files, we're talking about legitimate victims who are still waiting for justice. And we're still trying to figure out which power brokers were a part of that. Nobody's talking about anymore. This was a part of the campaign promises, from the president. He was going to put the right people in charge to do these things. And again, we're sitting here with an empty cup. When's it going to be filled?
I think it's coming. I really do. I think that there's. I think that there. I think that the revelations will be so surprising and so shocking that there may be a some reflection going on when are we ready for the shock that could really almost create an uprising, a new civil confrontation. And then there's the question of those in high places that are implicated.
Yes.
And there's no doubt that there are a lot of people in high places that are implicated in the most horrendous crimes. And there is really no more horrendous crime than pedophilia, than destroying a child's life.
100%.
That is equivalent to murder or worse than murder. So that's what we're dealing with the Epstein files. Nothing short of that. So how many elites were involved in this? A large number. But I think we've got to deal with it. We got to trust God that when we pursue the truth, let the chips fall where they will, and that God's will be done through the revelation of truth. We've got to have truth. This is why the censorship regime that cropped up, it's always been there, but it really came out in spades in the early COVID period, and it's really stayed with us. We can't get at truth unless we have a strong enforcement of the First Amendment. We have to have free speech. Any incursion, any censorship that we have in America will be the undoing of this great country. Because you don't get
Do
to
you
the
think it's
truth
coming?
unless you debate, unless you uncover, unless you discuss, unless you look and talk about everything. And that's what free speech is. It's tough. And when you're talking about revelations of criminal behavior by people that supposedly were establishment people, maybe in government, in the corporate world and so forth, it's shocking, but it has to be done. It
Yeah.
has to be done.
And I want to talk about free speech in a second, but I'm going to go back to this and just do a hypothetical. What if the reason why we're not getting, for example, the Epstein files, the list of people who visited that island or were part of what was going on there? What would happen, do you think, Scott, if the list is right down the middle? A whole bunch of people on the highly connected political right, maybe even elected officials, and a whole bunch of people on the highly connected political left, including elected officials, and a resignation. And the list, let's say it was leaked the way they've been leaking stuff from the Pentagon. Some of the enemies in the deep state who are trying to take down Hegseth, who are trying to take down Trump by the way of that. What if somebody gets their eyes on it and leaks it, and all of those people come down? How does the nation recover? What happens if Republicans and Democrats are both implicated in something as barbaric and grotesque, and what I think you are correct in saying is probably every bit, if not worse than murder? The rape and the destruction of young children. What if it brings down the whole of government? on both sides. What do we do then?
Well, it won't bring down the Constitution, and
Okay.
that's, and remember, all of our government officials, at least all of them that are voted into office or appointed by the president, and all our military leaders, they take an oath of office, don't they, to defend the nation against enemies,
Foreign and
foreign
domestic.
and domestic enemies. In other words, there was a recognition. I mean, I think the oath of office goes back to the founding period. Who drafted this language of the oath of office? How could there be domestic enemies? Well, there were domestic enemies from the very beginning. We had traitors at the
Sure.
time of the Revolutionary War, didn't we? Yeah.
100%. Absolutely.
So we may have more now as a
We
percent.
absolutely have many now. There's no question of that.
Percent of the population, I think we have more corruption now than at any other time in our history, and this is a very big problem. And so I'm I applaud you for raising this issue and pursuing this issue in your other podcasts, because this is probably one of the most important issues of our time. I think we have to trust that when we get to the truth, uh, some people will find that the only way back is through repentance. Others may commit suicide. Others may have no way back because they refuse to submit uh, to the only solution, which is, hey, I screwed up, God. Will you forgive me? And you know what God's answer is, no matter what the crime is? The Christian God that we know through Jesus Christ is that all sins can be forgiven. But in forgiveness comes rebirth, comes redemption, and a new course in life. And there are many testimonies of hardened criminals whose lives were totally transformed. And when you think about the success of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, it's largely a Christian-based success story. Admitting your sin, confessing it, admitting it, and that out of that comes the power to change your life. In other words, God's power is great, but we've got to get God to work in people's lives, and that's usually done by, it starts out with repentance, acknowledgement of our failure. And when we do that and we ask God to help us, God answers that prayer.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I'm glad you brought it up because I was asking you about spirituality, and you talked about the spiritual and the cultural decline of the country and where it is right now, and that's a big part of it. And spirit and faith are so closely intertwined. I want to go back to the Constitution. I want to go back to the freedom of speech thing because you were talking about it in the context of the individuals on certain lists, but I just want to talk about the fact that the UK has all but abandoned free speech. They are locking people up for Facebook posts. Here in the United States, over the course of the last several years, we saw people being booted from Facebook and booted from social media platforms for saying things that somebody in a high office said, we don't want other people to know. So we're going to call it disinformation or misinformation or malinformation. And then we're going to cancel the account of that person. We have to silence these people. But in the UK, it's worse than that. Not just canceling accounts, but you're going to jail because you wrote something on Facebook that somebody else found offensive, and that has a cost. Same thing is happening in Germany. Same thing is happening to an extent in France, and it is absolutely happening in Australia and in New Zealand. So we're
Absolutely,
talking
right?
we're talking about some formerly semblance of free countries, the way we like to call ourselves the freest nation in the world, but a lot of our former allies in that regard are literally saying you can't say whatever you want to say, we will lock you up if you do.
Yeah, it's scary. It really is scary. Uh, but when we compare all those nations you just listed to America, what's the difference? The difference is that we have a constitution with a Bill of Rights. The first right is the freedom of speech. The protection of free speech is ingrained in our government. And so any chipping away of that, everybody's, everybody should react and respond to that very strongly, that we cannot have any, diminution or undermining of this First Amendment. We witnessed during the COVID period and subsequent to that an ongoing tendency to want to stop speech that people don't want released, whether it's the medical establishment, the pharmaceutical companies, or it's the or it's any number of other.
Or the wrong pronouns, or dead
Yeah, wrong.
naming somebody. I mean, seriously, people are losing their jobs for these things.
I know, but the founders. It's really interesting how the founders really saw America even before we were a nation. Both the Pilgrims that came over to, they ended up coming to Plymouth by accident, actually, because they were blown off course in 1620, and 10 years after that, in 1630, the Puritan migration under John Winthrop was the leader of the Puritans that came in 1630. Both both Pilgrims and the Puritans both acknowledged that they likened their course in crossing the ocean, coming to a new land, a rugged, uncivilized place. They likened their course to the Israelites leaving Egypt to get to the promised land. In other words, their vision was that they were going to make America, the new world, a promised land. They were going to make it a promised land. And of course, it took time. We had 13 colonies on the East Coast, 13 very different colonies, but all of them were Christian colonies. And ultimately, we decided that it was time for independence from Great Britain. And what I point out in Rediscovering America is that think about the challenge of taking on the greatest military power in the world. The British Empire and the British military were by far and away the most formidable military power in the world. And here these 13 colonies, all of them quite separate and geographically distributed. There was no telegraph even invented by that time, so there's no communication between the colonies. How in the world were these colonies going to successfully wage a war of independence against Great Britain? And you could look at it, you can slice and dice it in many different ways, but let's just look at the naval side of it. The colonies had no military navy whatsoever when the war started. The British had amassed 250 warships along the East Coast, up and down the East Coast, concentrated, of course, in the key areas like Boston and New York and the Chesapeake Bay. 250 warships, 3 decks of cannons. Finally, the colonies were able to marshal 7 merchant vessels that were made for merchant purposes. And where could they put the cannon? Well, they had to put them on the top deck. How were 7 of those type ships going to take on the British Navy? Impossible. Impossible. And when we compare the troops, the training of the military, the equipping of the military, we were so outgunned, outtrained. We were so underfunded. There was no resources, no federal government. There was no, how are you going to fund this army, the Continental Army? How do you fund it without a central government raising money for it? Well, that's part of one of the more interesting stories in Rediscovering America is the story of this Jewish immigrant, Chaim Solomon, who came to Manhattan, New York in 1775, more or less a year before it was a year before the Declaration of Independence. Chaim Solomon came to America with the same vision for freedom. He's a Jewish family who'd been persecuted. His ancestries went through the persecution and the Inquisition in Spain. They moved to Poland. Anyway, Chaim Solomon fell in love with the patriot cause right from the very beginning. And it turns out that he was a very successful businessman. And he was able to raise money to support the War of Independence. Without Chaim Solomon, this story, we would not have been able to fund the Continental Army's success. Now, why don't more people know about Chaim Solomon? Well, he's Jewish. And remember, it's the victors and the victors' culture that determine the accounting of history. and the vanquished don't have much of a voice. That's true with the Civil War, the Confederate versus the Union. We understand the Union side better than the Confederate side. But Haym Salomon's been neglected by the history books, when in fact he's one of he's at a level of the founding fathers in terms of importance.
And what's so interesting about that is the fact that, and you started part of our conversation about this, is the influence of Christianity in the founding of the country. It was the
Right.
Christians, it was the Christian founders throughout the Federalist Papers, the Christian founders who recognized in our founding documents everything else. And yet it was a Jew who helped them, somebody who, of course, so religion, the point being faith and the faithful. And, we believe in the same God, which is why, not ironically, I suppose, we are a Judeo-Christian nation. So largely, but the answer to your question about how can 7 ragtag merchant marine ships, tangle with the British Navy of 250 well-stocked, ships, and the answer is just God. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
providential. I don't,
Absolutely.
I mean, you're talking miracle here. It would be
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
it would be
Our
like,
history is actually full of miracles, but historians who tend to be more secular in their orientation, they don't tend to be really
right.
appreciate the possibility of miracles. Even Christians have a hard time understanding miracles. So let me share with the audience one of the incredible miracles in our history. The
Please.
year is 1755. George Washington is 22 years old, and he had a military calling. We all know that. He just had this love of the military, riding horses and being in uniform, and he had a vision for his life in the military. He joined during the French and Indian War. He enlisted to serve under General Braddock. He was trained. He became a junior officer. He was a colonel, and General Braddock was charged with taking back Fort Duquesne up near Pittsburgh. This is in the French and Indian War. They're going to take it back from the French. In the valley of the Monongahela, on his way to taking on that battle to get that fort back, they were ambushed largely by Indians, and it was a perfect place for an ambush. It was an open field surrounded by trees on both sides. The Indians were hidden behind the trees. They were sharpshooters, and one by one, they began shooting at this large army of 1,400 people, but they focused on people on horseback because they were told those are the officers.
Right.
And if we can take down the officers, then we can capture the rest very easily. So one by one, the officers went down, including General Braddock. And it got to a point where all the officers were on the ground, dead or dying. And there was only one remaining. And he was a big man. That was George Washington. He was a big target. And Washington was on his third horse because his earlier horses, other 2 horses, were shot out from under him because they were shooting at him repeatedly. In any case, finally, Washington recognizes, well, I'm the only officer left. We're not going to win this. We got to retreat. So he organized the retreat. That night, around the campfire, I envision, he took off his coat, and he had 4 bullet holes through his uniform, through his coat. 4 bullet holes, not a scratch in his body. Washington at that time acknowledged that it was the protection of God. It was only the miracle of God's protection that saved his life. That stayed with him. He knew that he had the protection of God in his life. This gave him great courage. And so when he was chosen to be the commander-in-chief in the War of Independence, he carried with him this earlier life experience. So he always led from the front. He was a courageous man. He led from the front. He instilled great courage in his troops because he was a guy that's right in front. In modern war, you don't see that very often. Maybe General Patton. But in any case, Washington instilled courage in his troops so that they were able to be successful more often than they wouldn't be. But it was really it was faith, his courage, and then his persistence. It took 6 years to wear down the British. And even though the Continental Army lost more battles than it won, they won the final battle in Yorktown. And at that point, the British, after 6 years, said, we can't beat these people. They don't give up. and they
That's a great,
surrendered.
that
And
is a
that's the
great
end. That's the
example
end
of a
of
miracle.
the War of Independence. The freedom of America was born by that. It was born by a man of great faith and great courage named George Washington. That's why he's on our $1 bill. And but we've had a lot of great leaders. But that was a miracle. That's a story of a miracle that many people have never heard before.
No, I didn't know that either, and I'm so glad to hear you tell it now. And we're past our time here, but I'm going to wrap with this and just kind of make a comparison if you want. And I'm not suggesting, because the people who don't like Donald Trump's personality are going to say, how dare you compare him to George Washington? But honestly, a bullet that is headed for the head that ends up getting the ear because of the turn of the head at that precise moment to look at a chart that he had never referenced before. I'm not saying it's identical to having 7 bullets in your jacket and none of them struck your body, but you know what? I think there was something happening there. There was something, if you want to call it providential, you can. If you don't want to, that's fine. If you want to call it coincidence, but sometimes people who are leaders, miracles save their lives because they are not done yet. And maybe that's what's happening now. So,
And if I could add one interesting story to that, I agree with you that it was a miracle. But there may have been a greater miracle in early 2021, late 2020, after Trump lost the election. He was going he was fighting for a second term.
mm-hmm.
Uh, I think most people recognize there was voting irregularity, vote fraud may have cost him the election. That was certainly Donald Trump's vision. I mean,
Yes.
he made no bones about that. He stated it over and over and over again that there was fraud in the election, that he was deprived of a rightful victory, and that he was going to do everything he could to turn that around. Okay, he was determined to do that. And he had this January 6th meeting to bring patriots to the Capitol. At the time, they were certifying the votes so that their voices could be heard, and maybe, just maybe, that might be the last moment it could be turned around. We all know what happened. And in the end, Donald Trump had to concede defeat. Joe Biden took over. But was it that this determined man, Trump, would give up on this issue? Well, I think when we look back, we can see, America hadn't yet bottomed out. It needed to go through the Biden period to really see how bad it can get. And at the same time, Donald Trump had to go into the wilderness for 4 years so that he could be trained and raised up to really understand the enemy and be able to come back with a plan to defeat the enemy. Because if he'd had a successive second term, I mean, he was already pinned down all over the place in his first term. He would not have been able to accomplish in a successive second term what he's now accomplishing in this. So again, I think God's hand was in this because Trump was a very stubborn man, and he was determined, to overturn that election. But it wasn't. God
Yeah.
had a better plan.
Yep. I think that's a great example. That is a miracle. And you're right. I don't think, because he wouldn't have had the Congress on his side either if he had come back because of the, the turn. And it would have just been more impeachments and more of the same stuff to obstruct. Similar to what they're doing now. It's just that they don't have the numbers in Congress. Now they're using the courts for it, but I digress. I don't want to get too far into that. What I do want to say is thank you, Scott, for a great conversation and for rediscovering America. I urge people, we'll put that cover up on the screen again for everybody to make sure they read that book. And thank you for shining a spotlight on it. Obviously, there is a lot of work left to be done if we're going to restore this country to some of its former glories. But in order to get there, we need to know what they were, and that's a large part of what your book does, and this conversation advances. So we really
Well, it's a
appreciate it.
large part of what you do, Bob. I mean, you're a great voice for America's future, and I thank you for it.
Very kind of you to say. Thank you, Scott. All right, that's going to do it for today's Strictly Speaking. And if you like what you saw, make sure you share this video and make sure you share the link. And also, of course, hit the like and the subscribe button wherever it is that you're watching it, on Rumble, on YouTube, or on True Blue, or on Spotify. Tell folks about Strictly Speaking as well, and we'll see you next time.